Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phone. On Saturday, November 2nd at 10 a.m. in the Winter Building next door, we'll have our next Community Curation Day, this time focusing on donating family artifacts and papers. Reserve your spot on the department's website, then bring your historic artifacts, documents, and small family collections, and MDAH Acquisitions and Collections Coordinator Laura Heller will advise you on next steps. Then on Friday, November 8th, join us for our annual Veterans Day ceremony at 10:30 a.m. outside on the Entergy Plaza that will include a performance by the 41st Army Band. Admission to the museums will be free to veterans or active duty military, along with a guest that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and that's also an excellent time to see the Flags from Mississippi Emblems Through Time exhibit before it closes on November 8th. And I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch when Tom Henderson will present Fallen Comrade, 3 Mississippi Marines in the Korean War. Today, we are delighted to have Crystal Sanders to present Black Southerners and Graduate Education During the Era of Jim Crow. Crystal R. Sanders is Associate Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She was previously Associate Professor of History and Director of the Africana Research Center at Penn State and was a 2020-2021 National Humanities Center Fellow. Sanders earned her BA in History and Public Policy from Duke University and her MA and PhD in History from Northwestern University. Her new book is A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation Scholarships, and the Debt Owed to Public HBCUs. We were fortunate to have Dr. Sanders give a virtual History is Lunch during the pandemic on her first book, A Chance for Change, Head Start and Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle. And we're excited to welcome her here in person today. Help me welcome Dr. Crystal Sanders.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Mr. Goodwin for the opportunity to participate in the History is Lunch program and for that gracious introduction. And thank you to all of you for spending your lunch hour with me today. As Mr. Goodwin said, I will be talking or basing my remarks today on my newest book that's titled A Forgotten Migration. So we'll jump into it. And I typically like to start with a story. From 1946 until 1950, World War II veteran and Clarksdale native Aaron Henry flourished academically and socially at Xavier University of Louisiana, a private, historically Black Catholic university in New Orleans. Henry had managed to remain at the top of his class throughout the tenure of his studies, and he had been elected class president on more than one occasion. In his last 2 years of pharmacy school, he received tuition assistance from the state of Mississippi, which supplemented the financial support he received from the GI Bill. So what you see on the screen is a list of Black Mississippians who received funding from the state of Mississippi in fiscal year 1949. And if we go right here, it was highlighted, but it doesn't really show number 37 on the list. 38 on the list is Aaron E. Henry. It shows that he was studying pharmacy, and in fiscal year 1939, he received $132 from the state. I apologize that that this particular document is slanted in the scanner. It went into the scanner slanted, and so that's why it's not completely straight. When Aaron Henry walked across the graduation stage in June 1950, it was not lost on the soon-to-be 28-year-old that segregation made his life much more difficult than it had to be. Had he been white, he could have pursued pharmacy school at the University of Mississippi. Yet segregation compelled him to study elsewhere. While having to leave the state for the same opportunities that white Mississippians had in state was bad enough, even graduating was an obstacle for the out-of-state student. Xavier required students to participate in commencement exercises in order to receive their degrees, but the New Orleans school's graduation was the exact same day as the pharmacy board examination in Oxford, Mississippi. The Mississippi native had every intention of being a pharmacist in his home state, so missing these boards was out of the question. In order to be in 2 different states on the same day, immediately after walking across the stage, Aaron Henry caught a flight to Memphis, and then a friend drove him to Oxford. When the pharmacy board exam results were made public several weeks later, Henry had scored the 3rd highest grade. Mississippi contributed $132 annually to subsidize his tuition cost at Xavier University. After graduating and passing his boards, he opened the 4th Street drugstore in Clarksdale, a place that would become a hub of political activity beginning in the 1950s through the 1970s. To feign compliance with the legal doctrine of separate but equal, beginning in 1948, the state of Mississippi paid for its Black residents to go out of state to pursue the same academic degree programs that were available in-state to white residents. The state appropriated $25,000 for this purpose during the 1948-1950 biennium. One telltale sign of Black Mississippians' desire to reach their highest intellectual potential was the widespread demand for these funds. In an effort to meet that demand, the 1952 Mississippi legislature tripled the appropriation to $75,000 for what I call segregation scholarships. The Board of Trustees of the State Institutions of Higher Learning awarded the scholarships. For certain, Black Southerners had been leaving home for graduate study long before Aaron Henry did. For example, Virginia's Carter G. Woodson became the 2nd African American after W.E.B. Du Bois to obtain a doctorate degree from Harvard, doing so in 1912. Educator and North Carolina native Anna Julia Cooper earned her doctorate from the University of Paris in 1925. What was new was Black Southerners pursuing graduate study with financial assistance from Southern state governments. Aaron Henry was one of the thousands of Black Southerners who took advantage of what I call segregation scholarships to pursue either baccalaureate or post-baccalaureate study in the North, Midwest, or West because their native flagship institutions denied them admission on the basis of race. I refer to the funds the states appropriated for Black citizens' graduate and undergraduate training as segregation scholarships because the entire point of the tuition assistance was to preserve segregation. Missouri introduced the idea of appropriating money to send Black citizens out of state for graduate training in 1921, and they finally allocated funds 8 years later. In subsequent years, 15 other southern and border states would join Missouri in setting up systems of providing scholarships to Black students to study out of state. Many of these states paid for their segregation scholarship programs by taking money from their already underfunded public Black colleges. Most states referred to the tuition assistance as out-of-state tuition aid, obscuring its true purpose. The states with the largest Black populations were the last to create segregation scholarships. The only southern or border state that did not provide any provision for graduate study for African Americans was the state of Delaware. So when you look at the screen, I've listed all of the states, beginning with Missouri, that started a segregation scholarship program for African Americans. So we see all the states of the former Confederacy, and then all of the border states, except for the state of Delaware. As you'll see, the states with the largest Black populations were the last states to create their segregation scholarship programs. And it's going to be interesting to look at the dates, and in parentheses, I put the dates that the states created their programs. And as you'll see later in this lecture, it's interesting because in 1938, the United States Supreme Court said that segregation scholarships were unconstitutional, that they were illegal. Yet despite that court order, we see a whole slew of states don't even create their programs until after the court said they were illegal, right? So as I tell my students, right, a court order means nothing without enforcement. and there was no enforcement of the court order. So that's why we see states from North Carolina to Mississippi kind of thumbing their nose at the court and creating a program that had already been ruled unconstitutional. The arrangement of sending Black students out of state for the same educational opportunities that white students received in state was actually the brainchild of a Black man, Walthall Moore, who you see pictured on the screen, who was elected to the Missouri State Legislature in 1920. Moore's presence in the State House would set into motion a number of important educational changes for African Americans not only in Missouri, but throughout the entire southern region. Prior to Moore's election, Missouri rarely provided its Black citizens the same educational opportunities as its white citizens, a practice that helped to preserve segregation and the racial caste system that limited African Americans' social, political, and economic trajectories. An Alabama transplant, it would be Moore who introduced out-of-state tuition grants for Black college students and made advanced degrees a more realistic possibility for Black Southerners. The grants were the first of their kind in the United States, allowing Black students to study at Black or white institutions that admitted African Americans and that offered graduate study. This arrangement, right, of paying for Black students to go out of state served as a forerunner to the equalization strategies that Black activists pursued to improve Black education at the elementary and secondary school levels. Less than a month after taking office in January 1921, Walthall Moore introduced a bill seeking $1 million to improve higher education for African American residents of his state. The state's sole college for African Americans, Lincoln Institute, was a far cry in terms of funding, physical plant, and academic offerings from the well-funded flagship institution for white residents, the University of Missouri. Moore's end goal, though never realized, was an upgraded Lincoln that gave African Americans in Missouri the same opportunities that were available to white residents of the state. So essentially, Walthall Moore's bill was to make Lincoln the Black counterpart of the University of Missouri, right? And so Moore envisioned being able to do this. He envisioned it would probably take 7 to 10 years to really upgrade Lincoln, to ensure that Lincoln had the types of buildings that existed at Mizzou, to ensure that Lincoln had the academic programs that existed at Mizzou. And so Moore says, in the interim, while the state is improving Lincoln, we will pay for Black residents to go out of state so that they can have the same opportunities that white students have in state. So that becomes this section of the bill that says may arrange for attendance at a university of any adjacent state, right? And the state would pay the tuition fees. So Moore really saw this as a temporary measure. He said for about 7 to 10 years, Black students are going to have to leave the state to get a master's degree, or leave the state to get a PhD, or leave the state to get a JD, or leave the state to get an MD. But after Lincoln is fully upgraded, that will no longer be necessary. Unfortunately for Moore, what he envisioned as a temporary arrangement, his colleagues in the State House envisioned as a permanent answer to Black demands for educational equality. His colleagues in the State House believed that it was cheaper to outsource the state's responsibility to provide educational opportunities to its Black residents than to actually put money into Lincoln University. So what starts as a temporary, idea or a temporary initiative would turn into a 30-year plan in the state of Missouri of making Black students to leave home. What we will see is that across the South, white legislators sitting in these southern state legislatures found it more economical to outsource indefinitely their state's responsibility to educate African Americans rather than to build up their state's public Black colleges. And this is the point I was getting to earlier. It's important to note that many states continued their segregation scholarship programs until the late 1960s or early 1970s, defying the historic 6-2 decision in Gaines v. Canada, where the United States Supreme Court ruled that states had a responsibility to offer white and black citizens the same education within their borders. So essentially, in 1938, the Supreme Court is saying Missouri can't say that it has provided separate but equal for African Americans when it's making those African Americans go to New York for the same things that white residents are getting in Columbia, Missouri, where the University of Missouri is located. So essentially, the court is saying a state doesn't have jurisdiction beyond its borders. So the court is saying segregation scholarships are not, or they could desegregate graduate and professional school programs at historically white institutions, or they could establish separate but equal graduate and professional school programs at black institutions. So the court is essentially saying you've got to create separate but equal within your state's borders. Segregation scholarship programs are not the way. They're unconstitutional. The Gaines decision was the first successful legal challenge against the doctrine of separate but equal and paved the way for the 1954 Brown decision. To go back to that slide I showed you, in response, North Carolina established a few underfunded graduate and professional school programs at public black colleges. So I know we have at least one graduate of North Carolina Central's law school in the building, Dr. Holmes, calling you out. But North Carolina created its law school in 1939, right? They created it to say to the Supreme Court, we're working on it. We're trying to ensure that we have equal opportunities for black and white residents. So we're going to create a segregation scholarship program, but we're going to point to this law school to show you that we are making a good faith effort to enforce the court order. Now, in reality, North Carolina colleges, present-day North Carolina Central law school was severely underfunded. In the 1950s, students at that law school would go into federal court and demand that the state of North Carolina provide additional resources because of how underfunded North Carolina College's law school was in comparison to the law school at the University of North Carolina. But when we look at a lot of these states, Texas is going to create a law school in response to the Gaines decision. South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, they all create law schools. And I would say throughout the 50s and 60s and 40s, these are severely underfunded law schools. So we see that there's not a real compliance with the spirit of the Gaines decision. I'll keep going. And first, I should just say, so most of you would probably read, Lloyd Gaines was the plaintiff in that Gaines, in the Gaines case, right? He was the plaintiff that the NAACP brought forward because Gaines was a native of Missouri. He had graduated from Lincoln University. He had known since childhood that he wanted to be an attorney, but he was also the oldest son of a widowed mom. So he had no interest in going out of state. So he partners with the NAACP. His case, the NAACP loses it all at the lower courts, but that was not in any way discouraging to Charles Hamilton Houston, who had wanted to get to the court of last resort. And when they got to the Supreme Court, they indeed got the victory. The problem was, in response to the Gaines decision, the state of Missouri said that they were going to create a law school at Lincoln University. Lincoln University had never gotten the $1 million that Walthall Moore had tried to get for it in the 1920s. In 1938, anytime it rained, Lincoln University had to close. They didn't have one single paved road on campus. All of the buildings had leaks. So Houston says, well, it's okay that they want to create this law school at Lincoln, right? We're going to go right back into court and prove that the law school at Lincoln is not the equivalent of the law school at the University of Missouri. However, before they can go back into court, Lloyd Gaines disappears. He had been living at a fraternity house in Chicago, Illinois, and he tells his roommates in early 1939 that he's going out to buy postage stamps. He's never heard from again. Many civil rights attorneys and historians, myself included, believe that Lloyd Gaines was killed, right? He had been the face of this major lawsuit to begin to equalize education for African Americans in the United States. Many segregationists maintained that Lloyd Gaines simply left town. They claimed they went on vacation in Mexico and they saw Gaines himself, so that he was alive and well. But we must remember that the reason he refused to leave the state for law school when Missouri offered to pay for it was because of his mother. And his mother went to her grave saying there's no way that my son could be alive anywhere on this earth and not have made contact with me. The Gaines family, even as late as 2 years ago, was asking the Justice Department to reopen this case, right? It's always remained unsolved. No one knows what happened to Lloyd Gaines. But this was a reminder to other African Americans who perhaps were deciding whether they should take a segregation scholarship or partner with the NAACP and be a plaintiff in a legal challenge was that their lives would be in jeopardy, right? Their lives would be at risk. There's going to be many people who say, I don't want to work with the NAACP after what happened to Lloyd Gaines. Thousands upon thousands of Black Southerners would use segregation scholarships to reach their highest potential, including many nationally known individuals such as attorney Fred Gray of Montgomery, Alabama, and Christine King Ferris of Atlanta, Georgia. In my remarks today, I will focus on a few segregation scholarship recipients, including some Mississippians. One common theme among recipients who attended historically white institutions was that Northern institutions did not roll out the proverbial welcome mat for Black Southerners. Such was the case for historian John Hope Franklin. Franklin was in the first wave of African American Southerners to benefit from segregation scholarships. He received $100 from Oklahoma to offset expenses at Harvard during the 1935-1936 academic year. So when I was writing this book, I was going to archives all across the country here at MDAH, Oklahoma, Maryland, North Carolina, going into state archives and looking for these exact types of records. And they would just be listed typically in the state superintendent's records of names of African Americans and the funding they received. And so Oklahoma does their funding by quarter, so you actually see John Hope Franklin's name listed twice. But each quarter he received $25 for a total of $100 for the 1935-1934 academic year. In the year that Franklin received funds, that was the first year that Oklahoma provided scholarships for African Americans. And in that year, they provided $5,000. But as would be the case in Mississippi, the demand was so great that that money was quickly exhausted, and the Oklahoma legislature had to quickly, in an emergency session, appropriate more funds. Because in Oklahoma, the only public Black college was Langston University, and Langston did not offer any graduate or professional school programs, even though the University of Oklahoma did. So as a native of Oklahoma, John Hope Franklin was eligible for one of these segregation scholarships. Franklin recalled that he found Harvard to be a socially challenging place for Black students. He said, and I quote, "A day and often an hour didn't go by without my feeling the color of my skin, in the reactions of white Cambridge, the behavior of my fellow students, the attitudes, real and imagined, struck by my professors." End quote. Racial slights at the Ivy League institution were not simply perceived. In a class where John Hope Franklin was the only Black student, he endured the professor telling a darky joke without shame. Persevering in an anti-Black space, Franklin mastered the historian's craft of interpreting the past, as evidenced by his seminal work, From Slavery to Freedom, which exposed the contradictions at the center of the nation's founding. From Slavery to Freedom has now sold over 3 million copies, been translated into over 10 languages, and it's a reminder of just the phenomenal and influential careers that so many segregation scholarship recipients have had, in terms of whether we're talking the academy, whether we're talking medicine, whether we're talking law, whether we're talking K-12 education. These were African Americans who equipped themselves with the credentials and the skills to improve life for other African Americans across the country. And Franklin's experience at Harvard was not an anomaly. Those who received out-of-state tuition assistance routinely faced racial discrimination and social ostracism while studying in institutions outside of the South. After they graduated, these institutions would refuse to hire them. So even someone like John Hope Franklin pictured there in his doctoral regalia on his day of graduation in 1941, it would be a very long time before any white institution considered having him on their faculty. In fact, John Hope Franklin wrote From Slavery to Freedom while on the faculty at North Carolina Central University. As scholars have pointed out, historical narratives of the Great Migration have tended to obscure the entrenched realities of Northern racism, Another person that I talk about in the book is Christine King Ferris, right, of the famous King family. She's the older sister of Martin Luther King Jr., and she essentially said, being raised in a political family in Atlanta, I was well-versed in racism. She says, I knew racism. I knew how to respond to racism. She said, but nothing had prepared her for the racism she experienced at Columbia University. She entered Columbia with a segregation scholarship from Georgia in 1948. She graduated from Spelman that same year with an undergraduate degree in economics. She planned to become an economics professor, and she says when she got to Columbia, that was the worst time of her life because not one single professor in the economics department would acknowledge her. So she would be sitting in the classroom. If she raised her hand to ask a question, they pretended like they didn't see her. If she just yelled out, the students and the professors pretended like they didn't hear her, and so she actually said, am I real? Am I not a ghost? But even the students had conspired with the faculty to make her feel unwanted. And after that first semester, her father said, come on home. You don't have to stay there and take that. But she says, you know what? I want Georgia to have to pay for me to get something. So she decided to change her major. She left economics, moved over to education, graduates from Columbia in 1950 with a master's degree in education, and then she comes back to Spelman, where she would have the distinction of becoming the longest-serving faculty member at that institution before she retired in 2014. To keep African Americans out of Louisiana State University, lawmakers paid for the woman you see on the screen, Jewel Lamar Prestige, a graduate of Southern University of Baton Rouge, $375 per semester to pursue graduate study in political science at the University of Iowa. Throughout her time in Iowa City, housing was always a challenge. She recalled decades later, it was almost impossible to find a house or apartment that would rent to Negroes. After the university began allowing Black graduate students to live on campus, she shared a dormitory room with a friend who had graduated 2 years earlier from her alma mater, Southern. Prestige later recalled that while she had never lived outside of the South and in such a cold climate, having a roommate from home made her adjustment easier. After her friend graduated, things became difficult again. She lived alone for a while, and then she had another Black roommate. When that roommate left, the university assigned her a Filipino roommate, but only after that student signed a form stating that she agreed to live with a Black student. And so often, the segregation scholarship recipients that I write about would talk about the fact that these institutions they attended had not been all white institutions, right? So a place like the University of Alabama or the University of Missouri admitted non-white students. There were students from Japan, students from China, Native American students. You could attend as long as you weren't Black. And so even when most of these institutions began admitting African Americans and allowing them to live on campus, they would never put them in a room with a white person, but they would be put in a room with a non-white, non-Black student, and they would make sure that that student was okay living with the Black person. But they never asked the Black students if they were okay living with someone of another race. In 1954, at the age of 22, Prestige became the first African American woman in the United States to earn a PhD in political science. She pioneered scholarship on African American women legislators and mentored nearly 50 Black students who went on to earn doctorate degrees in political science during her tenure on the faculties at Southern University of Baton Rouge and Prairie View A&M University. She also served as a dean at both institutions. Prestige used her educational opportunity to create opportunities for successive generations of Black political scientists, and in the process, made the academy much more inclusive and diverse. Among the hundreds of Black Mississippians who received segregation scholarships was Merlene Jones Graves, born in 1922 in Heidelberg, Mississippi, which is in Jasper County. In 1937, her family moved here to Jackson, where they became active members of Central Methodist Church. Graves graduated from Tougaloo College in 1946 and later matriculated at Northwestern University in Illinois, where she earned a master's degree in education in 1954 by taking classes for several consecutive summers. During the 1952 fiscal year, Mississippi awarded Graves $130 to offset her tuition, though she was on the hook for her transportation and lodging. Graves began her teaching career with the Jackson Public School System in 1952, teaching English for 32 years at Jim Hill High, Brinkley High, and Murrah High. In every single state with a segregation scholarship program, Black public school teachers made up the majority of the scholarship recipients. These teachers sought out the additional training in order to stay abreast of the latest trends in the field and to ensure that they were offering Black children in underfunded schools the most effective pedagogical practices possible. Black teachers also wanted the additional training to increase their salaries, which were often less than their white counterparts. The University of Michigan, Ohio State, New York University, and Teachers College, Columbia University were the other popular graduate school destinations for Black educators. Professional school study in law and medicine were also popular paths for segregation scholarship recipients. One of the most prominent civil rights attorneys of the 20th century was R. Jess Brown, who you see pictured on the screen. Brown was born in Kansas, grew up in Oklahoma, and moved to Mississippi after World War II. In 1951, Brown matriculated at Texas Southern University Law School, which was created to keep African Americans out of UT Austin's law school. After 2 years at Texas Southern, Brown successfully passed the Mississippi bar exam without officially completing law school. During his tenure at Texas Southern, Mississippi gave him $190 annually. As I like to say, we oftentimes say, well, the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. When I look at the careers of many of these segregation scholarship recipients, I say that those tools can be used to weaken the foundation, because that's exactly what Brown did. Using the legal training he received with Mississippi's financial assistance, he took on a host of civil rights cases. For example, he represented a Black pastor in Jefferson Davis County, challenging Jim Crow laws that sought to bar Black votes. He also represented Mac Charles Parker, who was lynched before he could stand trial. A year after that, Brown represented Clyde Kennard, who was arrested on false charges of stealing chicken feed. Brown also helped represent James Meredith in his successful 1962 bid to enter the previously all-white University of Mississippi. And time again, no matter what state that I'm looking at, I find that many of the Black attorneys who secured legal training through a segregation scholarship would come back home and use that training, right, to begin to dismantle white supremacy in all of its forms. Another really good example of that is Fred Gray of Alabama. Fred Gray, after graduating from Alabama State, goes on to Case Western Law School in Ohio. Fred Gray told me even before he boarded the train to go to Ohio, he had made up in his mind that he was coming back to Alabama and he planned to sue Alabama every chance he could. And he did that, right? He graduates from law school in 1954. He immediately takes and passes the Alabama bar, sets up a law office in Montgomery. 1955, he's thrust into the national spotlight as Rosa Parks' attorney. In 1955, when the bus boycott organizers, including King, are arrested, he's their attorney. He would go on to desegregate 112 of the 120 school districts across the state of Alabama. He would represent the survivors of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And even today, in October 2024, Attorney Gray is still going into court almost every day. When I was trying to interview him for the book and I called his law office and I said, I would like to speak to Attorney Gray, and the woman that answered the phone said, he's in court, can he call you back? And I said, oh, there's some mistake. I'm not looking for Attorney Gray Jr., I'm looking for Attorney Gray Sr., because his son also practices. And the woman says, I knew exactly who you were looking for, and he's in court. And I thought to myself, at that time, he was probably 84, 85. I was thinking, how is he still in court? But he's still in court today, still practicing, still trying to ensure that everyone has access to quality representation. In the arena of medicine, two standout Black physicians who were also segregation scholarship recipients were Aaron Jackson and Robert Smith. Since African Americans could not attend the University of Mississippi Medical Center, the state made segregation scholarships that were quasi-loans to Black Mississippians who studied medicine. Students could receive a maximum of $5,000 that was forgivable at a rate of $1,000 for each year that the physician practiced medicine in Mississippi. Aaron Jackson, a native of Mississippi's capital city, earned his bachelor's degree from Morehouse in 1956 and his medical degree from Howard University in 1960. He practiced medicine in Greenwood before relocating to Iowa and later Washington, D.C., where he had a long career serving on Howard's medical school faculty. Another Black Mississippian physician who definitely needs no introduction is Dr. Robert Smith. You see Dr. Smith pictured on the right side, Dr. Jackson on the left side. Dr. Smith graduated from Tougaloo with a bachelor's degree in chemistry in 1957, and he earned his medical degree from Howard in 1961. His return to Mississippi coincided with a growing civil rights movement in the state, and he became, as all of you know, the doctor to the movement. So just as we think of Fred Gray or R. Just Brown as attorneys to the movement, Dr. Smith, another segregation scholarship recipient, was the doctor to the movement. And given my first book, I would be remiss not to mention that Dr. Smith served as the medical director for the Child Development Group of Mississippi, which was the largest inaugural Head Start program in the country. While segregation scholarships helped to create a strong and vibrant Black middle class throughout the South, not everyone with professional school aspirations benefited from them. And when I look in the archives, there are a variety of reasons why everyone doesn't benefit. Some don't benefit because the state simply ran out of money. So the state would say, we've already given out $50,000 this year. We're not giving out any more money. So sorry, if you can't pay your own whole way, you just can't go. There were many people who couldn't leave because of family obligations. So even if the money was there, they had to stay close to home to help out their families. And then there were those who did not want to accept the funds because they saw them as unconstitutional. And such would be the case for Medgar Evers, who desired to study law in his native state of Mississippi. He applied to the historically white University of Mississippi School of Law in 1954. Before outright denying his admission because of race, state officials offered him a segregation scholarship. Evers declined the aid because he said, I want to practice law in Mississippi, so I want to learn Mississippi statutes. So I'm not going to go to law school in another state and have to learn their statutes and then have to turn around and learn Mississippi statutes so that he could sit for the bar. So he would be someone who declines the segregation scholarship that was offered him. I should say that Fred Gray talks about studying. He had a whole system where he studied the Ohio statutes in the morning and the Mississippi statutes at night. So he's doing double duty in law school for 3 years. And when he graduates, he indeed takes the Ohio bar and the Alabama bar. Other African Americans did not have the benefit of segregation scholarships because of racist schemes by scholarship administrators or Black college presidents who often had a say in who received money. In the rare event that a public Black college offered the same academic program as its white counterpart, or school officials asserted that the programs were the same, Black Southerners could not receive tuition assistance. Such was the predicament of Vicksburg native Merle Beasley Evers. She finished high school in 1950, 2 years after Mississippi established its segregation scholarship program. She had planned to attend Fisk University with state aid to study music. The state's Board of Institutions of Higher Learning required Black residents to confirm that the state's Black colleges did not offer their desired course of study before applying for a segregation scholarship. So in Mississippi, you had to verify that whatever program you wanted to study out of state was not offered in-state at one of the public Black colleges. Merle Evers, or at the time Merle Beasley, contacted both Jackson State and Alcorn. Alcorn officials stated that they only offered a minor in music. Jacob Reddix, Jackson State's Black president, with no knowledge of Merle Beasley Evers' extensive piano training, wrote that he thought his college offered enough music for Evers' needs. The state board summarily denied her request for a segregation scholarship, even though Jackson State did not actually have a music major. Disappointed and feeling cheated, Beasley decided that she would not go to Jackson State out of protest about what Reddix did, and she ends up enrolling at Alcorn, and shortly after getting there, meeting Medgar Evers. It's probable that Reddix, the president of a black college controlled by white politicians, stymied Evers' efforts because the all-white Board of Institutions of Higher Learning wanted to grant as few segregation scholarships as possible. Colluding with them in this instance would have been money in the political bank for Jacob Reddix as a black administrator. The practice of compelling black students to leave home to secure the same educational opportunities that white students received locally should be understood as a form of racism, just as pernicious and evil as racial violence. Like lynching and disfranchisement, segregation scholarships were supposed to maintain white supremacy. We can point to segregationist governors standing in schoolhouse doors, or law enforcement officials turning water hoses and dogs on nonviolent protesters, and label those actions as racist without difficulty. We must not, however, ignore the polite forms of racism that were maintained by bureaucracy and designed to preserve the racial status quo of white superiority and black inferiority. We must not forget the silent bystanders who propped up the racist exploitation of black talent by refusing to speak up and say that the arrangement was unjust, unnecessary, and downright ludicrous. By making their personal peace with segregation scholarships as a middle ground, even the most well-meaning white official embraced the idea that there was something so peculiar, so insulting, and wrong with black people that required them to be educated elsewhere. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for questions. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. One is, I'm curious, even with today, but what made Walthall Moore so optimistic that the state of Missouri was going to do what he was asking them to do? Do you know that?
I mean, I can only go by the published accounts of what Walthall Moore said publicly. But when he was running for office, one of his main platforms was that he was going to improve education at all levels for African Americans. I believe that Walthall Moore sold that bill as a way of presenting the desegregation of the University of Missouri. So he's able to tell white lawmakers, look, African Americans aren't trying to get into the flagship institution. African Americans will not sue to get into the flagship institution. What African Americans want is an upgraded Lincoln. So he's able to convince literally 90% of, it was 90% in the State House. The Senate was unanimous to support that legislation. But here's the kicker. They voted for it in 1921, but they don't fund it. So Walthall Moore, in subsequent sessions of the legislature, is going back saying, when are we going to fund this program that I've created? You're supposed to be upgrading Lincoln, and you're supposed to be helping African Americans to secure graduate and professional school education. So even though the legislation is, approved, right, in 1921, it's not until 1929 that they actually put some money towards it, and it's never the full amount. So Lincoln was supposed to get $1 million. The initial appropriation for Lincoln's expanding and upgrading the physical plant was about maybe $20,000, maybe $25,000. So a very big difference from what was promised to what was actually received. And so in fact, in the years after 1921, the black press writes a lot about it and essentially says the Missouri legislature has given African Americans a gold brick. They kept on calling it a gold brick. This was a promise that was never made good on.
Okay, my second question, with Charles Hamilton Houston determined to make each state pay, I'm curious, was the Missouri cases, were those his first cases?
Yes, so let me first say, when Charles Hamilton Houston comes to the NAACP in 1934, they've invited him to join their legal staff, and he comes and says, well, I'll join under one condition. He says, the NAACP has been spending a lot of time and money trying to get a federal anti-lynching bill. And he says, you all are not going to get a federal anti-lynching bill. He says, I don't know what you're thinking, but you're never going to get passage of that bill through the United States Senate. And so he says, you need to think strategically and think about essentially low-hanging fruit. And so he says, let's try to get enforcement of orders that are already on the books. And so there's Plessy, right? 1896, separate but equal. And Houston says, with respect to graduate education, we don't have separate but equal. We have separate and non-existent. So Houston says, we can go into court and win this. This isn't going to be a huge battle because the court is going to say they've got to at least have the same opportunities. The court will enforce its own precedent, right? So 1934, Houston is believing, yes, we're going to go into court, we're going to do this. But then Houston knew, well, Houston doesn't believe that separate but equal is possible. So his goal was to get a court order saying separate but equal. Then when Southern states created these underfunded programs at black colleges, to go right back into court and show that separate wasn't equal, right? That was Houston's goal. So the first case actually came out of Maryland. That was the Donald Gaines Murray case, right? Donald Murray, native of Baltimore, who wants to go to the University of Maryland Law School. The problem with that case is that they won. Like the NAACP won at the lower court and they won at the Maryland State Court, or Supreme Court. After that, the University of Maryland decides they're not going to take it to the Supreme Court. So the problem with the Murray case was that it doesn't have a national precedent. It never makes it to the Supreme Court. So there is a black man who enters Maryland's law school in 1935 and graduates in 38. That's Donald Gaines Murray. So after it is apparent that the University of Maryland was not going to appeal to the Supreme Court, Houston needs another plaintiff. That's when they find Lloyd Gaines. And so Lloyd Gaines becomes their plaintiff. Then they quote unquote win, but they've got to go back into court and prove that Lincoln's Law School isn't the equivalent, but then Gaines goes missing. And so after that, the NAACP has a lot of trouble initially finding plaintiffs. They end up in Missouri finding Lucille Bluford, right, a black woman who wants to pursue graduate study in journalism. As her case is making its way through the courts, the University of Missouri closed their journalism school, right? They're willing to close the whole school rather than have to admit her. So then the NAACP, that's how we get into the 40s, right, with the cases of Sweat v. Painter out of Texas, right, the case of McLaurin out of Oklahoma, the case of Scipio out of Oklahoma. We see all of these other cases where Houston is still trying to create precedent, trying to really force Southern states to admit African Americans into their graduate and professional school programs. So it was a very a brilliant legal strategy, but a long legal strategy. But when we take all those cases together, we begin to see he was laying the groundwork for Brown, right? So he's getting all of these court orders that are going to make it even that much easier to begin to look at black education at the elementary and secondary levels. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, Houston is all behind all of this. And so that put him at odds with black college presidents who are saying, well, if we can just get some grad programs at our school, we'll be happy. So if you go through the NAACP papers, there's all of this correspondence between Houston and other people, and they say these black college presidents are a thorn in our side. We don't know why they're not getting on board and understanding what we're trying to do. So, okay.
I take your point that the purpose for these scholarships were in service of a continued segregation and a continued undermining of education of African Americans during this period. But as you pointed out, there are several of these students who seek and achieve graduate degrees. Their option for employment afterward is to teach in the HBCUs throughout the South and in other states. And so an unintended, perhaps, consequence, though, is a cohort of educated professionals, people who had higher level degrees from some of these highly acclaimed institutions across the country, and that expertise does land and does end up with mentorship potential at the historically black colleges and universities. Did you see that?
Most definitely. When I started the project, I thought it would be a brain drain narrative. African Americans leaving the region, never coming back. over 90% of them come back, right? And they come back because, like Dr. Smith, they know there's a need for professional health care for African Americans, right? They come back because of people like Fred Gray, who understand there's a need for African Americans to have adequate representation in courts. And a lot of them come back because this is their home, right? They want to be among their family and friends. Many of these people who take jobs teaching at HBCUs, these were their alma maters. They understood the power and potential of these institutions, but these institutions also needed them with terminal degrees. That's a factor in accreditation, right? So it helps that you had all of these PhD holders on faculty.
Would you not say that we went from desegregation to integration because of Brown versus Board of Education? But in the meantime, the desegregation still existed because as the university presidents of the black institutions against NAACP, once they started offering the master's degree, the educators in Mississippi, black, who could not attend Ole Miss and Mississippi State, they had to go to the nearest black institution that offered it. That's how my father got his master's at Tennessee State, and my mother had to go to Atlanta University for her doctorate. But it's still, when they came back, segregation still existed. And although Brown versus Board of Education was supposed to be the result to integration, so that there would be no more segregation, it still was not fully enforced until the late 60s. So even when they came back, although you say, well, okay, if they went to white schools or blacks off the desegregation bill, that they could come back and do a better life, but they couldn't work anywhere else other than the segregated schools until integration. Because we never even talk about desegregation anymore. It's all about integration moving forward.
Well, I don't think we've ever had integration. I do believe we've had desegregation, right? So it was very one way. But with respect to these black public school teachers, when they're coming back into these all black schools, they are not just highly trained, right, with the credentials from the best institutions around the country, but they have much more training than their white counterparts. And so when we talk about when we began to see in the late 60s, early 70s, the movement toward unitary school systems, right, where black and white children are supposed to be going to school, oftentimes it would be black principals and teachers who lost their jobs when you had too much manpower. Who was the first fired? And it's ironic that these black public school teachers were the first fired because they were the ones with these MAs and sometimes PhDs from Michigan and Columbia and NYU. And so there's a professor at Howard who's really looked at school districts, looked at kind of the initial years after desegregation, and she found in every single school district they would rather get rid of teachers who had more training, who were black teachers, than to hire them over their white counterparts. And so when you try to explain how they got all this training, that's where the segregation scholarships come in, right?
Really interesting. As segregation as an economic model of doing business is a bad model. And I'm wondering, there are people who capitalize on other people's ignorance of running a business, and that's handicapping your own business by taking away a talented pool. I'm wondering if there were people or institutions on the other side that said, okay, their misery, whatever, we're going to exploit it and perhaps advertise or incentivize people coming to our institutions. So in other words, were there institutions on the other side, the receiving end of these, that were saying, come here, we want this, or any of those types of actions?
Not necessarily saying coming here, but because of word of mouth, because of, we could also say, the Great Migration is going on at the same time. So African Americans were well aware of railroad routes that would get them where they need to be. So North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, you're going up straight up the East Coast. You're ending up in schools in Philadelphia, schools in New York. A lot of the teachers from Alabama, Mississippi are going to Chicago, right? Like Marlene Graves. Just as the Great Migration, that train, right, was going to go straight up the Gulf, right, and come into the Midwest, into places like Illinois and Michigan. So you can see these trends where black students from Louisiana, a ton of them are going all out west to to California. So they're following the same train route. So in that respect, I think it's more of a word of mouth. Sometimes they had family there, so they say, well, at least I have to go far away from home, but I got a cousin who lives in Chicago, and I'm a native of Sunflower, Mississippi, so at least I'm not going to be completely alone. I know someone who's there. So you typically find those types of connections. But about the economics of this, the end of my book says the debt owed to public HBCUs, because I believe there's a debt for two reasons. Number one, over half of these states paid for their segregation scholarships by taking money out of the annual budgets of their public black colleges. So the state of Tennessee says every time we have to pay for a resident of Tennessee to go out of state, that money comes out of Tennessee State's budget. Arkansas, every time a black resident of Arkansas leaves the state for graduate study, that's coming out of Pine Bluff's budget. The same was true of 9 other states. So when we think about that, right, and this was big business. In 1 year, so Florida was the same way, and in 1 year, Florida spent nearly $80,000 to send black Floridians out of state, right? That was $80,000 in 1951. If we put $80,000 in 2024 dollars, that's a six-figure amount, a high six-figure amount. And think about that was 1 year. So if we think about this over, 30 years, that's a significant amount of money that was robbed of FAMU's budget, right? The same thing with Tennessee State. The other reason that I say that there's a debt owed, because Southern states had options. They didn't have to send all of these people out of state. They could have invested in their public black colleges. They could have created graduate and professional school programs at these institutions, but they chose not to. We know that when we think about higher ed, your revenue-generating programs are your graduate and professional school programs, right? Even though undergrad costs an arm and a leg, universities really make their money through your law school tuition, your medical school tuition, your business school tuition, your vet school tuition. These were opportunities that the state could have invested, right, in these programs at black colleges that would have created revenue-generating programs that would be beneficial to them today. So there's this debt owed, and we have to figure out how we're going to reconcile that. Just last year, the Biden administration sent letters to 16 southern state governors saying how these southern states had underfunded their black flagships from 1987 to 2020. To give you an example, the Biden administration said from 1987 to 2020, the state of Tennessee had underfunded Tennessee State of $2.5 billion. And when I read the letter, I said, well, why did they start in 1987? Because Tennessee started its segregation scholarship program in 1936. If you go into the archives in Tennessee, you can clearly see all of the money that's being diverted from Tennessee State to pay for segregation scholarships. That debt is really closer to about $8 billion. And so when we see now that these institutions don't have the resources for infrastructure, don't have the resources to expand, to have more dormitories, to bring in more students, we have to ask ourselves why. And we can see this long history of underfunding, this long history of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and that has created, right, a debt that's preventing these institutions from being able to do all of the expansion projects that they want to do today.
Now I know why I came to this. Some would know the dream team that OJ had. Tell them about the dream team that Thurgood Marshall had when all those two cases.
So,
the dream team.
yes. We could start with, Thurgood Marshall, being a native of Baltimore himself, had wanted to go to the University of Maryland Law School, but because the University of Maryland did not admit African Americans, even though they admitted Native Americans and Asians, he goes to Howard University. And at Howard, he's mentored by Charles Hamilton Houston, who had been on the faculty and then become dean of Howard Law. And when Charles Hamilton Houston gets to Howard, he essentially says, so people were really mad at him in the Howard community because he kicked a lot of people out of the law school. And the reason he kicked a lot of the students out was that he said, everyone that's going to be at Howard Law is going to become a social engineer. And if you're not interested in being a social engineer, you might as well leave because you're a parasite. So essentially he was saying that he's training, right, lawyers to literally go into court and use the law as a weapon. And if you weren't interested in that, if you didn't show that you could do that, then he didn't think you needed to be there, right? And so Marshall became one of his star pupils, but there were also a host of other star pupils. But starting with the Murray decision in 1935, Houston brought Marshall on staff and said, even though Marshall had had his own law practice, Marshall had graduated in 1995, he brings him on and says, you're going to start doing some part-time work for the NAACP. I want you to work with me and to kind of see how we can use Plessy as a way that's going to end up desegregating the University of Maryland. Marshall, who had wanted to go to the University of Maryland, was very happy to work on this case. He's like, you know what? Let's stick it to them since they denied me of opportunity. But over, we could say between the 1930s and 1950s, there would be a host of other black attorneys mentored by Houston who come onto staff working in various cases around the country. So in Missouri, it would be a black lawyer by the name of Sidney Redmond. In North Carolina, it would be a black lawyer by the name of Conrad Pearson. In Virginia, it would be a black lawyer by the name of Spotswood Robinson. Many of these men have been trained at Howard by Houston, and now they are putting into practice what he taught them, right? And he assembles this dream team, we could really say, really comes together by the time of Brown. And that's what's so sad, because by 1950, Houston is getting really sick, right? He's working really hard, he has heart problems, he's not necessarily prioritizing his health. And so, as you know, he doesn't live to see the Brown decision, but he had created or brought together the men who would, see it to the finish line, who would get that court order. But all of the strategies that they're using were the strategies that he had created.
We have copies of both books by Dr. Sanders over here. I know we had more questions than we had time for. I apologize for not being able to get to all those, but I bet you'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have over here. Don't forget about the events that we have coming up, the Community Curation Day, the Veterans Day program. I hope that we'll see you back here next week when Tom Henderson is our speaker. For now, help me thank Crystal Sanders for this fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.